science, and I minored in human rights. And I was really interested in the intersection of these two issues. And I explored it a little bit through research by looking at the connection between climate and gender violence in India, and also through campus activism outside of academics. I was part of an environmental student organization, and we held an event highlighting environmental justice to raise awareness on campus. And so when we were planning this event and wanted to highlight a racial justice issue, I suggested environmental justice, not even realizing what a momentous occasion it was for New Jersey right now. And recently found out about the legislation that was getting pushed through that all these panelists have had a hand in. So I would like to introduce our panelists to you first. I'm going to start with Melissa Miles. Melissa is a grassroots activist and organizer living in an environmental justice community in Newark. She recently assumed a new role as executive director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, which is the only New Jersey statewide environmental organization whose mission is focused on environmental justice and whose leadership is a majority people of color. She's part of several national coalitions, as well as the New Jersey Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which advises state agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection on issues of environmental justice. Although Melissa holds an MA in anthropology from the New School, she believes the best solutions to the world's current environmental crises come from communities. Thank you for joining us, Melissa. Next, I'd like to introduce Kim Gaddy. Kim is the environmental justice organizer for Clean Water Action of New Jersey. In this role, Kim develops and implements grassroots environmental justice campaigns and coalition building efforts in New Jersey. She's been advocating for communities impacted by industrial pollution and the goods movement for 19 years. She was appointed by Governor Phil Murphy to serve as vice chair of the NJEJA Environmental Justice Advisory Council and was a founding member and board member of several EJ organizations. Previously, she worked in municipal government in Newark for 12 years and served as the first female chief of staff for Councilwoman Mildred Crump. Next, I'd like to introduce Senator Troy Singleton. Senator Singleton devoted his life to public service in government, political, and policy posts at all levels. After graduating with a degree in business administration and finance from Rowan University, he began his career as a legislative director for New Jersey Assembly members Herb Conaway and Jack Connors in the district he would come to represent. In 2011, he was elected to his first term in the New Jersey General Assembly, representing over 220,000 residents of the 7th Legislative District. In 2017, Senator Singleton was elected to the New Jersey State Senate, where he currently serves as chairman of the Senate Community and Urban Affairs Committee, vice chairman of the Senate Economic Growth Committee, and as a member of the Senate Budget and Appropriations Committee and Judiciary Committee. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Nicky Sheats. Nicky is the director of the Center for the Urban Environment of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University, and has made supporting environmental justice the primary mission of the center. At Thomas Edison State University, he works on air pollution, climate change, cumulative impacts, and EJ legal strategies. Nicky is a founding member of a number of EJ organizations, including the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, where he currently serves as the board chair. Early in his career, Sheats practiced law as a public interest attorney. He holds a BA in economics from Princeton University and earned a JD, MPP, and PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Harvard University. So I want to get right into the conversation, but beforehand, I just want to let the audience know that there'll be time for questions. So make sure you drop your questions in the Q&A chat if you think of anything. So first, I'd like to start with you, Melissa. For those who are not as familiar, can you explain what environmental justice is and why is the environment a racial, health, and economic justice issue?
So I think you started down the path in your explanation, in your question. There's many definitions for environmental justice. Historically, the term, was really used and coined by environmental justice leaders in the South, such as Dr. Robert Bullard and others. I myself was told that this term by a historian, that the term was originally used by a very young girl who was an activist who later died of cancer. But no matter how you look at it, the way that I think about environmental justice is that it's a community's right to stand up for the place that they live. And it's a community, an individual who lives in a community's way of taking accountability, right? So at some point, my personal story is that at some point while living in Newark, I realized that the way that, the types of things that I was exposed to, like trucks and incinerator pollution, was not normal. That, not everyone in New Jersey lived like that. And that the fact that my son had asthma and so many kids in my community had asthma was not normal. And so that is what launched me, into my career as an organizer and an advocate. And so for me, environmental justice means, it's us that are most impacted that, stand up, and take action to make a change. You're muted, Shree.
Oops. Yeah, that was a great explanation. I think what was really important that you talked about is how communities really need to stand at the center of environmental justice, as they have a right to stand up for where they live, as you said. So I want to turn to Kim Gaddy to also talk about her approach to environmental justice, which New Jersey municipalities are most impacted by environmental injustices, and how can organizing be an effective tool in uplifting these communities?
Well, thank you for having me and the opportunity to kind of share what we do throughout the state of New Jersey to ensure that, our communities, our frontline communities can have access to safe, affordable, quality drinking water and clean air to breathe. That is our human right. And so when you think about the municipalities that are impacted by environmental injustices, you think about my city. I'm a fourth generation Newarker, Jersey City, Elizabeth, Camden, Trenton, Patterson, just to name a few. And one of the reasons that I like being an organizer is that it's a very effective tool to begin to engage, to be able to empower, but more importantly, to listen to the voices of these communities that who are suffering from the environmental degradation each and every day. And so when you reach out to these residents, you have the opportunity to reach them where they are. And then they have the opportunity to describe to you what they want to see in their community. We always say we don't need individuals parachuted into these neighborhoods. These residents have all the answers and they can solve their problems. Give them the resources, give them a seat at the table, give them meaningful participation, and they can change the situation that they have lived in for so many years. And so I use this tool as a way to educate them, inform them, but then allow them to have the space to develop what the solutions are for their community. And because now you have these individuals who feel more confident, now the organizing becomes a tool. It becomes a tool that they have now that they can strengthen and establish confidence within their own neighborhood, block by block, ward by ward. Now they can begin to spread the word and begin to get individuals to kind of join them to change how their neighborhood looks and to begin to change their quality of life. And so the organizing allows us to begin to have strength in numbers, and it allows us to not leave anyone behind. And so that's why I appreciate the opportunity anytime that I have to be able to go into these communities, have dialogue, sit down, hear firsthand what it is that they are suffering from, and then use that as an organizer to lift up those issues so that we can bring some justice, right? Because unfortunately, not everybody does this work as a job like most of us. They have other things. And so, although they appreciate their environment and they want to engage, when you don't have a job, when you don't have food, when you don't have a roof over you, the environment gets pushed down. So when we could be able to come in as an organizer and meet them where they are, I could go to a PTA meeting and start talking about the conditions in the school. Right now, I use that as an organizing tool to talk about my issues that can now, they don't have to have another meeting. They can talk about it at the PTA meeting. And so it's an effective tool.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you raised a really good point about often why I think environmental activism doesn't have a lot of people of color traditionally is because there's so many more immediate problems facing people of color in this country and in this world. And I think it's not always the first thing in their mind. And often when environmental problems are painted as conservation issues or things that are going to happen 50 years later, people can't really worry about that. And I think that's what's great about environmental justice, that it really brings it back to the people and how it's affecting people. So thank you for sharing that. And I think also it was great to hear from your organizer perspective. I'd like to shift more to legislation and talk to Senator Troy Singleton about the bill that he sponsored and how it addresses environmental injustices, as well as his plans for future EJ legislation now that this bill was finally signed into law.
Good evening, Shree, and thank you for this opportunity to talk here tonight. I think what this bill does, and now I get to say what this law does, which is incredible. It really ensures that the color of one's skin and the thickness of their wallet no longer will be able to determine their ability to breathe clean air. And while there's some level of eloquence and seemingly straightforwardness to that comment, what this bill does is finally give a voice to communities that for so long have been voiceless, and being able to stop the most egregious instances of pollution causing facilities being placed in their neighborhoods. So in a more formal sense, what the bill does is it will require that anyone seeking a permit for a new, expanded, or renewal has to go through a process where the cumulative impacts of that permit and that facility in certain areas that, based on the census tract, have been already deemed to be overburdened. The cumulative impacts are assessed by the Department of Environmental Protection. And the Department of Environmental Protection now has a tool at their disposal to say, A, you're either not going to put this facility here, or B, if the facility's here, you're going to have some new conditions on where you're going to change and modify your facility so that they're not emitting pollution into the atmosphere, into the air, which has so much of the asthma that we've heard about, the congenital heart failures that we've seen and the data has told us. And this labor of love that is going on for well over 10 years, close to 12 years to get us to this point is truly about making sure that those who have to live with the consequences of these facilities have a voice in determining before it's too late whether or not this can move forward and happen. So we're excited about what this law means and what it does. We're excited that the administration finally will have the tools to say no, and say no and mean it. And more importantly, the community. And I keep going back to that. And when this law was signed, and all my friends who are speaking here tonight, we were together that day. I said so much of this is not about the name of Senator X or Assembly Member Y. It is truly about the voices in the community that never gave up on fighting for their neighbors, and fighting for neighbors, some that they did not even know, to make sure that the environment was going to be different now. And there's a saying that talks about environmental justice, and I know Melissa talked about it a little bit, but one of the sayings that I've heard often is that no community should have a greater environmental burden than its environmental benefit. And for far too long, communities of color and communities of lower socioeconomic means did not have the ability to reap an environmental benefit, but got all of the environmental burden. And that's our opportunity now with this law, to be able to say enough is enough. And our community, our children have an opportunity to breathe clean and fresh air. So we're incredibly excited about this law. The regulation, which is the next component of it, as we're thinking through what comes next. The regulation, which the Department of Environmental Protection will have to put out. All of us are going to be diligent about that to make sure that the regulations match the spirit of the law. But for us, thinking through other environmental justice initiatives and measures that we have to work on. We have to make sure also that the growing green economy and and solar and so many other renewable energy projects, that right now the economic benefit has escaped communities of color, quite frankly. From a justice standpoint, we need to make sure that there's an investment, not just on the workforce development side for these tools and measures, but also that the benefits of a cleaner, green economy make its way into our urban sector and urban centers. So that's what we're going to continue to fight for, making sure there's equity in the evolution of energy policy in our state and in our country.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important point to bring up, how it's an economic issue for communities of color and how they haven't really had the opportunity to benefit the same amount from green jobs and infrastructure. I also was reading a little bit about how this impacts women in terms of jobs that are often supported by green energy policy is often construction trades and things that tend to be male dominated. And so people are looking more into care industries and things like that. So I think it's really important to think about where we're putting our investments and our monies that can benefit not just the environment, but also all the people in our communities. I also want to now shift a little bit to more about the national realm and hear from a lawyer's perspective. So I wanted to talk to Nicky about the Trump administration changes to the National Environmental Policy Act and how it's going to harm EJ communities, and why did the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance ultimately decide to join a lawsuit against these new regulations?
Good question. I don't think it's been talked about enough, probably, but for good reason. We're so involved in trying to get the cumulative impacts law adopted, which of course was great work, worth the time. So a little background on NEPA. NEPA, basically the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, basically says that if there's a major national project or activity, then an environmental evaluation must be performed, either an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. And previously, before the administration changed the NEPA regulations, NEPA required part of that evaluation to be a cumulative impacts analysis. And we've talked about cumulative impacts. We haven't really defined it. People can think of it as the impacts and risks caused by multiple pollutants, usually emitted by multiple sources of pollution in the community, and the impacts and risks caused by these pollutants individually and when they interact with each other and with any social vulnerabilities that exist in the neighborhood. And cumulative impact analysis is extremely important for an EJ analysis, environmental justice analysis, because so many neighborhoods, as others on the panel have said, so many EJ neighborhoods, communities of color, low-income communities, have multiple sources of pollution in them and elevated levels of pollution. And our laws and regulations don't do a good job of dealing with cumulative pollution, because it sets individual standards for pollutants. So to do a good EJ analysis, you really need to do a good cumulative impact analysis, whether that's qualitative or quantitative. And now that the NEPA regulations have been stripped of that, NEPA will not be as effective in protecting environmental justice neighborhoods. And that's why NJEJA joined the lawsuit, because we've done a lot of work on cumulative impacts. And we saw this as a real threat to NEPA and a real threat to EJ communities. And the fact of the matter is NEPA needed to be strengthened to give more protection to EJ communities. It didn't need to be weakened. Another important factor, important problem with removing cumulative impacts from NEPA is that cumulative impacts is still not accepted as, say, a legitimate concept in every state in the country. Much longer doing cumulative impact analysis. That's one reason why the law in New Jersey is so important. And it's a reason why having cumulative impacts in NEPA was important, because then, folks across the country, they're working on different cumulative impacts issues. If people challenge them and say, well, is this a legitimate type of analysis that needs to be performed, they could always point to NEPA as a law and say, yeah, sure, look, it's in NEPA. Now they can't do that anymore. So NEPA is now less protective to EJ communities, and that's why we're suing, hopefully to change that, but at least to bring attention to the issue.
I definitely think it's really interesting to hear because there's no express EJ legislation at the national level yet to see how other environmental bills can be used to support EJ communities, and also really sad to see how that's being stripped right now when it really needs to be strengthened, as you said. I want to turn back more to the local level with Melissa and talk about more of the progress that we've made in New Jersey, because in 2016, Newark made history with the first environmental justice ordinance in the nation. And now we have the first EJ law. So kind of talking about bringing together organizers and policymakers and legislators, how can activists and policymakers work together to keep this momentum going? And what additional legal protections or legislation would you like to see going forward, considering your activist background?
I think, one important thing to remember is that, as we move into the regulatory phase, we have to have the mechanisms by which, I'm sorry, one moment. We have to have the mechanisms by which to enforce, the regulations. So, folks need to be in place, regulations need to be in place. One thing that we see with the Newark Cumulative Impacts Ordinance, which, was worked on by folks like Kim and Nicky and, Ironbound Community Corporation, Ana Bautista, is that, you need a body that can really, do the work, right? Right now, that ordinance, is being upheld by a volunteer body. Folks like, Kim was saying, have day jobs that they need to maintain, and are expected to do a really incredible amount of work that is not always, looked at and not always taken into account. It's sort of more like a suggestion than a regulation. So, we know, seeing, that is often an issue, right? We sometimes have good ideas, but they need to have teeth behind them. And I think that that's mainly what people want to see, is good ideas and good intentions that, have teeth and are able to really protect communities. And I definitely remember, many a time as an organizer with Ironbound Community Corporation, sitting with the DP while we and our alliances went through permits, sort of line by line, looking for the issues, doing, what even the DP didn't necessarily have capacity to do, but we brought together folks to do it. Only to be told that there was nothing that could be done. They were operating within the limits of their permits, and that, they couldn't take into account the fact that there was also a facility down the road or across the street. So, this, as others have mentioned, makes it possible for communities to have real meaningful participation. Like Kim mentioned, some of us, have the privilege and the honor to serve communities and, as our profession. But the community voices are really what's most important. We can't show up to these meetings alone. We have to show up with the community members that are most impacted. But how often can we get someone out, when they see that their voice has not made a real change in things? So, I think that this is an example of, community voices finally being heard. I'm really proud to be able to take this back to our folks and say, like, look, this now makes it possible so that when you come out and give your testimony, the DP actually can move based on it. And so now what's most important is that, in the next phase, we give, the law the type of mechanisms and levers that it needs to really do that, and not let it be weakened or watered down by folks who are afraid of process, and that's what we saw with NEPA, industries that did not want to do more paperwork, didn't want to do environmental impact assessments, didn't want to listen to communities. And, unfortunately, our administration sided with them. So, I'm really proud to be a part of a state where, our administration sided with the people and, and can say that, the people are going to stand behind this administration as they give this law, the strength that it needs.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points about the legislation and really making sure that it actually has an impact on the ground and being able to show your community that it is making a difference. Because as you were talking about, next step is writing the regulations for the law and making sure that it actually follows through on what it says. I want to also turn to talking more about lawsuits within New Jersey. As last month, New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal and the Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Catherine McCabe announced 12 additional lawsuits aimed at bringing environmental justice to 9 municipalities. So I was wondering what impact these lawsuits will have on EJ communities, if Kim could give some input on that.
Yes, I mean, I'm so glad that we finally have an attorney general and a leader of the DEP that understands the importance of making sure we hold the polluters accountable. For too long, we have lived in communities where we can go to sleep at night and we can wake up in the morning and you could walk down the street and say, what is this? What am I smelling? What am I seeing? I live in the south ward of the city of Newark, and I ride down Freeland-Hyson Avenue, and we have so many different polluting facilities. And some of them we don't even know if they have the right permits. We don't even know if they have the authority to even be in business. And so this is huge to be able to have lawsuits that finally holds these guys accountable. I have a saying in the South Ward, my backyard is the Port of Newark and the airport. And we know that port is the economic engine of the region, but it is the death zone of the residents. And so until you have, a commissioner of DEP and you have an attorney general that says this is enough, we have to begin to stop the environmental and health injustices that individuals suffer from just because of the zip code they reside in. And when you think about what our senator stated, we carry the environmental burdens each and every day, the cumulative impacts. And that's why the law that was passed is so important to us, and working hand in hand with now an attorney general that will enforce the law and kind of begin to get these individuals to pay for the pollution that they have put in our communities for too long. And so it is definitely a win for us. It's something that we have been waiting for a very long time. In our communities, frontline communities, the polluters never are held accountable. And so this is big for us to now begin to see. And the Attorney General actually advertised, and he actually reaches out to community folks even before he's coming into the community. So that's key also, right? Because he is now letting us know, listen, this is a problem that we have found out that is occurring in your community, and we want to reach out to you because this is what we're going to do. So now you don't have to hear it secondhand or a week later. You are actually hearing it from the Attorney General up front and DEP. So now that is real inclusion. And it really helps us in our community because these voices have finally been heard. We have been crying for years and reaching out for years to try to begin to change the situations in our neighborhoods. And so the ability to now find these businesses and these polluting facilities is just something that we have waited, far too long for. And now to have the regulatory authority to kind of come down on them and say, no, you are not going to be allowed to continue to pollute in these communities is what we have been looking for. We need DEP to be that regulatory authority and to protect our environment and our health. And so if we can change the situations that impact our health, then our quality of life will change. And so the impact of these lawsuits is huge for us. And it is so very important, and it's happening, across the state, and is happening more frequently. And so now people will also begin to feel as though they can call in complaints and see results. Sometimes community members don't want to call in complaints because, they say nothing's going to happen. So when you see the end results and you see individual companies being fined, now you have a community that now wants to participate and wants to call on DEP and Attorney General and say, hey, look, here's 5 more places that I want you to investigate. So that is also happening in our community where, again, now they feel as though someone is really caring about what is happening in the neighborhood. They are willing to now step up and inform them of these, because community folks know. They know what is going on. And so that definitely is something that we appreciate, specifically in the South Ward, because we've had some major wins in the South Ward with some of these, cases that the Attorney General have brought to the forefront. So that's what I think is most important, that now the community members feel as though action is going to happen and they will receive some relief in their neighborhoods, and that it is no longer going to be business as usual. Those days have kind of gone away. And so I'm just hoping that it continues, because there's so many more places that need to be fined, and the businesses need to begin to change their habits. And it starts with, the Attorney General and our DEP Commissioner saying that the health of the residents in the state of New Jersey is important. And we're going to prioritize environmental justice and health injustices in the communities that have been overburdened too long.
Yeah, I think you definitely made a great point about how now a lot of communities will have more faith in their representatives, in their government, in the fact that change will come and that they can really trust that they're being heard. I just want to remind everyone to post any questions they have in the Q&A, because we're getting close to time to open up for questions. I know we've been getting some from Facebook, but you can also do it on the Zoom. But before that, I have a couple more questions. I wanted to go to Senator Singleton again, because Kim was just talking about how a lot of businesses need to change their habits. And I know business and construction trades were the main opponents to your bill. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how there's this perceived tension between economic growth and environmental policies, and why is there a disconnect, and what do you think can be done about it? I think you're muted.
I think part of the challenge that we have is there's this misconception, frankly, that you can not have environmental justice and economic development and economic benefit running on parallel tracks. And I want to go back to something I said earlier on. One of the things that the law allows and the DEP commissioner can do is to put conditions on the renewal permits as they continue forward. And that's important because it will allow local communities to have an opportunity to secure that work and to be a part of that work as they look to modify the facilities as they're going to be put in place. So when I talk to folks in the business community who painted a more doomsday scenario about what this bill would do, we always circle back to this idea that there's real economic benefit into having a cleaner facility. There's economic benefit, there's tax benefit for the facility owners if their facilities are cleaner. The federal government, the state government offers various amounts of tax incentives for individuals to have cleaner, greener facilities, especially in any community, frankly, not just in urban communities. So what we tried to stress is that this can ultimately be an economic multiplier if we apply ourselves correctly and start thinking outside the box and not letting old norms pigeonhole us into saying that, oh, once the word environment is interjected into a conversation, then economic development goes out the window. And we've got to go beyond that mindset and work collaboratively to think that there is this growing component of the energy industry, as it were, using that as an example, using the energy industry. And one of the growing components of it is how energy efficiency is going to expand and grow. And if we're looking at these facilities, not just to make them more energy efficient, but to make them more clean, there's going to be a whole new brand of workers and a new type of workforce that's going to be needed to do that. And the ability to have individuals to come in and be a part of that, that will create economic growth. That will create an economic multiplier in and around the communities where some of these facilities are. So we spent a great deal of time talking through with those in the business community, those in the construction trades about this. We left the conversation with some understanding and some agreeing with us and some others not. But the proof will be in the pudding. And I truly feel that what we have done is threaded a unique needle, right? And threaded that needle well, in my opinion, of protecting the community, protecting the environment, but not stifling economic growth and economic opportunity. So we feel confident this law will still allow us that to happen.
Great, thank you for that. Right before we move on to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask everyone a question about more about how it connects to gender justice, because we're also speaking as now, and I also, when I was on campus at University of Chicago, I actually invited Jackie Patterson, who is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, to speak. And she has been really vocal about how environmental justice is a racial justice issue, but also is a gender justice issue. So I was wondering, what do you see as connections between gender justice and the environment? How do you see women in your communities disproportionately impacted by environmental issues? So anyone can start, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I can start. As African-American female, women of color, we actually stand at the intersection of multiple barriers. So when you begin to talk about gender and the environment, you have, like in the city of Newark, if you take 100 cities, we're probably number 33 or 34, with 51% of households led by women. And so you have these households that's led by women who have multiple barriers, where we have a system that is not equally distributed. So we don't receive the same kind of opportunities as white males and other individuals. We suffer from some health conditions and stress because we take on so many things. And then also, when you think about our environment, the environment that we live in, if you have a female head of household and they don't have the proper opportunities to have equal employment, their living conditions are not going to be the best. And so now their family and their whole, the community that they reside in, there's a lot of issues that then impact them. And so we have to begin to connect this with environmental justice and racial justice. We have to begin to change how women are accepted and how our gender is appreciated and not discriminated against. And so you're discriminated because you're a woman, you're discriminated by your jobs, your income, your family, right? And so now it's all connected because now you don't have the ability to connect to the right resources. You have a lack of access to clean air, quality, safe, affordable drinking water. you have lack of access to food, right? And so those are some serious issues that has to be addressed. And then one of the last things that I want to say is that it also signifies an intersectional approach to the needs of women, right? And what they need to make sure that their families can survive and that they could live and thrive in communities. So it's all connected. If you don't have the resources, you can't live in these thriving communities or neighborhoods. And so now your quality of life is impacted directly by climate and racial injustices. And I'll pass it on to someone else.
I think the any attempts that we see to dismantle environmental protections and to undermine science-based decision making, they cause significant harm, as it were, to women and communities of colors, which exacerbates all the environmental threats that folks already face. And if you think about it, I think we all understand that there's a synergy now between environmental justice and reproductive justice, frankly, because both of those movements try and move to seek to sort of address this systematic sort of disenfranchisement and disproportionate health burdens, frankly, as my friend Kim Gaddy said, borne by women of color. And it's something that we need to speak openly about. So when you look at the degradation of our clean air standards, if you look at the degradation of our clean water standards that Nicky has been fighting for and has talked about eloquently earlier, if you look at how some administrations have sided with polluters over people, you compound all of that, and is born on the back so often of communities of color. But even in that, when you drill it down, it's frankly born on the back of the women in those communities, the Black women, Hispanic women, the Asian women who live in those communities. And it has a detrimental health effect on their reproductive ability to move forward. So these two issues, like environmental justice and reproductive justice, they are intrinsically linked. And those of us who fight for one have to say we fight for the other, because there's no daylight between the two, because it is affecting women in our communities, and especially women of color who are being adversely affected because we do not have strong environmental justice policy tied bar to strong reproductive justice policy in our nation. And that's the work that I know Senator Booker is doing on the national level, and so many of us are supporting him on it. New Jersey should be the jumping off point for what happens next. And we need to see this wave make its way through all parts of the country. So we have a federal law that does this.
And I'd like to just, add on to that as well, with issues that there's no daylight between, them and environmental justice. You also have to think about mass incarceration and gentrification, right? So we have to take a step back. Why is it that Black women and women of color are bearing, so much of the weight of this particular discrimination because of mass incarceration, because, of the systematic, basically extermination and removal of Black men from communities, which then become extremely vulnerable, not just because they're men, but because, we have to remember the environmental justice movement in particular grew out of the civil rights movement, which was a multi-generational struggle of families and communities. We did not exclude. Right. So it wasn't that like the men struggled over here and the women struggled over there and the young people over here and the old people over there. No, that movement was successful because it didn't exclude anyone. And it was based on, a real commonality and identification of a common threat, which is white supremacy. It might not have been called that then, that's language we use more now. But, so at this point now, we have this multi-layered, we talk about intersectionality because we're breaking it all down, right? So like, environmental is one thing and gentrification is another thing, and, immigration is another thing, but it all has a common root. So, when you break down communities, there's many ways that communities like Newark and Camden and Rahway have been systematically broken down. And, And so it leaves a situation where children and women are bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental harm, right? And for women, as mothers, that means that, although both of my sons may have been exposed to lead as children, were they to ever show signs of lead poisoning in society, right, which is higher rates of violence and things of that nature, no judge will ever say to them, well, you grew up in Newark, you may have been exposed to lead, and here's one, thank you, and other things. And so for that reason, we'll be lenient. That doesn't happen. Right. So, and then we as mothers have to bear the brunt of that. So, I just wanted to really open up the picture and talk about this. There's a reason why that's happened, and we got to take some steps back from that. Thank you.
And I think we should let people know, Shree, that a majority of people in the EJ movement, and our leaders are women. And they're the heart and soul and the mind and the backbone of the movement. They do most of the work. And I just want folks to know that. And a majority of NJEJA's board is women. And that's the way it should be, because again, they're doing most of the work.
Thanks for all sharing your perspectives. I think Melissa laid it out really well about how it's all intersecting and how there's a lot of different layers to it. I had never considered the mass incarceration angle, so that was really interesting. But I also definitely have heard the reproductive justice angle, because a lot of people talk about reproductive justice as an issue of choice of whether or not to have a child, but also, if you look at the definition, goes further into saying the right to also raise your children in a healthy environment. And so there's a lot of overlap between that and environmental justice, especially for people of color and low-income communities. So with that, I'd like to turn to some audience questions we've been receiving on Facebook and in Zoom. So I'm going to start with one from Facebook. They said, I'm curious if there are plans to unite, inform, and organize EJ communities over the next year to learn how to communicate the health and environmental cumulative impacts to the DEP when considering future air permits. Currently, public input is only taken by the DEP Air Permitting Office when requested. It would be great to form a statewide working group of residents in EJ communities to support each other in these future fights. So if anybody has thoughts on that and really talking about how to communicate these issues to the DEP.
Well, I think the same coalition that worked for trying to pass the bill, Ironbound Community Corporation, Clean Water Action, NJEJA, we're still going to be working together along with Senator Singleton on the regulations. And certainly we'll be representing our membership, and any other folks who want to get involved, please contact us. There are going to be stakeholder groups, and they could probably join stakeholder groups, or we could do something, work with us to keep them informed and make them part of the process.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we had over 600 organizations that actually signed on and, was fighting with us hand in hand. And we do plan on doing Zooms, New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and Clean Water Action. We have various Zoom town halls, and we eventually will get back to having face-to-face meetings. And I know that in Newark and in our urban rings, we will be having small meetings, because it's all about now educating the community on the importance of the regulations and understanding, that there's a difference when you deal with regulations versus legislation. So there's an educational process that we also want to bring our, community members along the way, because as we begin to pass the torch to the next generation who are willing to take on the leadership, and Melissa is one, she's relatively new, but she got it, Nicky and I will be stepping back. So we have a responsibility to ensure that we teach the other EJ activists, community members, organizational leaders, the importance of understanding what is required when you are now looking at regulations. And if there are some ways that we need to change it so that there is more community input and more ability to have a say. I know Melissa and I serve on the DEP EJAC, and we already are looking at the different policies and how the communication from DEP has to change to make sure that they allow more people to participate in this process. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at with the DEP EJAC.
Yeah, I definitely think that question was going a lot to something that this bill aims to correct, is that a lot of this will require community input before they can even get a permit approved. And we had another question in the chat talking about, does this new law address the sites that are currently creating pollution, or does it only work if they're planning to make changes that need permitting? So if anyone has input on that, but also if you want to talk a little bit more in depth about what this legislation exactly does and how it'll work, that would be great.
The law in question is applicable to both new, renewals, and expansion permits. So basically the three types of permits that exist. For new permits, the law basically says in a nutshell that if it's been demonstrated that the cumulative impacts of siting another facility in one of the designated overburdened communities were to have severe cumulative impacts, the law says that the DEP shall not issue that permit. For renewals and expansion, the DEP has some level of flexibility, says they may not issue the permits, but the DEP can put conditions on the renewal or the expansion of permits in a certain area, expansion of a facilities permit if it's going to grow bigger, or the renewal of a facilities permit if it's not doing any growth, it's just the same facility. So the designation is between whether it's new, a renewal, or an expansion. DEP has the ability to say no, has to, for the law, say no to a new one that has higher cumulative impacts in an overburdened community. For both renewals and expansion, they may deny the permit, but DEP will and can issue conditions on the renewal permit or the expansion permit presented to them. And all of that is taken into consideration with the public input that now formally has to be a part of this process that for years, quite frankly, just wasn't. And that'll be a big game changer, because the advocates who you have on this panel and the advocates who are not here, who stand behind these advocates, are very vocal and are very aggressive and very good at making sure that their points are received and articulated and made known to the regulatory and legislative bodies to make sure that they produce action to stop these.
Thank you. I think we also have another question that's talking about, so we know in Newark that there was an environmental justice ordinance passed. Has there been similar movement in other communities like Camden? You mentioned, I know Melissa answered this question and was talking about Elizabeth and Rahway and other communities that she also works with. And I know Camden, I think, is in Senator Singleton's district. So it'd be interesting to hear what's getting done in other communities also about EJA.
Well, I don't represent the city of Camden. I do not. So I cannot speak to the city of Camden's municipal body if they've passed a resolution like this. I know there was some talk, and I'm sure one of my co-panelists can clarify it better than I. I know there was, I believe, a resolution that was passed by the city of Camden, but I just don't know definitively off the top of my head.
Yeah, some years ago, there was a sustainability ordinance that was adopted by Camden. It wasn't as strong as the ordinance that the city of Newark has, but it was a measure that was adopted within there. And it's been a while, so some other folks might know more. But I know, Nikki, we kind of, as we was working on ours, I remember them talking about their sustainability team and coming up with a statement. So Nikki, you might.
You know what I was going to say, Kim, I don't think that's been changed. But when we put together Kim and I were on the original NJEJA committee that put together a model municipal ordinance that we spent a year putting together. You know, our intention was to take that to other cities, start in Newark, and then take it to other cities. At the time, and NJEJA does have a statewide cumulative impacts policy, and a variation of that made into the ordinance. At the time, we didn't think we could get a statewide ordinance, a statewide law passed. So we were going to try to do it city by city. And, you know, we just have, we have capacity issues. The EJ community is vastly under-resourced when compared to environmental community. So we couldn't take it city by city. And then we had the opportunity to work on statewide and national cumulative impacts legislation, which we've done. Not to say that other municipal level ordinances would not be a good complement to the statewide policy.
You just touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth, since we do have a question in the chat. To what extent has the larger environmental movement embraced environmental justice? Environmental solutions like cap and trade policies have been areas of conflict between national environmental organizations, sometimes called Big Green, and frontline communities. So where do you see areas of convergence and divergence between Big Green and frontline communities?
Are you directing that to me, Shree? I know that was the, or for
Yeah.
Okay. So that is kind of $100 million question. Let me go over the good news, areas of convergence. I think just the fact that people now agree that environmental justice and cumulative impacts, those kind of issues, EJ altogether, cumulative impacts in particular, must be addressed. The EJ movement worked very hard to move those issues from the margins to the mainstream of discussion. There's also, NJEJA, ICC, and a lot of other EJ organizations around the country have a mandatory emissions reduction recommendation. It was actually developed, NJEJA had a hand in developing that, largely developed that, which says that power plants located in EJ communities have to reduce their emissions. Now, although there's some convergence around that, you mentioned the debate over cap and trade. And I don't know if people know this, but the EJ community does not support carbon trading. So New Jersey is in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a carbon trading system, and we oppose that. But we couldn't stop the state from re-entering it. By and large, the environmental community has supported that cap and trade system, and it's caused bitter divisions that we're trying to get over and work together, but that's still a huge division. We don't like cap and trade largely because we think climate change mitigation policy needs to be used to address the disproportionate amount of pollution in EJ communities. The cumulative impacts legislation is great, but it won't do it alone. It's got to be combined with other policies. And climate change mitigation policy is one of them. And maybe the most important thing I have to say about this is the divergence continues, and we're going to have to find a way to bridge it, but there's going to be a large fight coming up in the next few months over a policy called Transportation and Climate Initiative, TCI. And that's going to be an initiative that's going to involve the RGGI states again, 10 northeastern states, and it's going to be aimed at reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from mobile sources. And the problem from an EJ perspective is, again, cap and trade is at the core of it. And again, cap and trade does not guarantee emissions reductions in EJ communities, which we won't. And so we have said, take away cap and trade from the core of it and put in policies that not only fight climate change, reduce emissions from mobile sources, but also make sure those emission reductions happen in EJ communities. That's not been done. So the EJ community is going to oppose New Jersey entering the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And we need some support on that, because right now it looks like most of the environmental community, if not all of us, going to support that. The EJA community is not going to support that, and we need some support on that. So if people have questions, please contact us. If you think you can support us on that, please contact us. And if you just want information on that, we can give that to you, because it's going to be a very important issue.
Thank you for making that point. I think that's kind of the core of it, is that it's not just about reducing pollution, but also making sure that reducing the disproportionate impact that it's had on low-income communities as well as minority communities. Because just legislation that doesn't consider how it affects people in different ways is not really going to be equitable and effective. And so with that, I think we've run a little bit over time. So I want to thank everyone for their questions, as well as thank the panelists for their time and for all of their insight into this issue. If you have any final thoughts, I'd invite you guys to all share anything before we close.
Thank you so much, Shree, for inviting me and my colleagues to speak tonight. And I just wanted to reiterate, what Nicky said. When it comes, I was in a meeting once about RGGI before New Jersey entered back into RGGI. And what became so clear to me that it actually had nothing to do with people and nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with the market. Now, we as Black folk, as people of color, we know that the market has never really operated, to benefit poor people and people of color. So why would we begin to rely on the market now, to save our communities and to save our planet? So, it's just sort of like the thinking is all backwards. And, we really hope that our allies in the environmental community can trust us that, we don't need this kind of incremental, maybe we'll get there solutions. We need real solutions, and we need them quickly. And we need, these communities, these groups that say that they're about EJ to follow our lead. And I'll end there. Thank you.
And I too want to thank you, Shree, for allowing us to participate and engage on this very, very important topic. We have a saying as environmental justice organizer, we have to speak for ourselves. And it's very, very important that, as Melissa and Nicky stated, and one of the reasons that we attended the People of Color Summit in 2001 in DC, and we came right back to New Jersey. And Nicky and I are one of the co-founders of New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, because we needed to have that kind of voice in our state, right? We needed to make sure that individuals was hearing from people of color who live in these frontline communities, who experience the environmental degradation on a daily basis. Melissa and I both have children who are asthmatic. So this was a very personal fight for me. And so we are definitely, but we're all family. We don't always agree on everything, but we do agree on the fact that our communities are not healthy. And whatever we need to do to change that situation and to reduce the amount of asthmatic children in this state, to reduce the amount of autistic children in this state, which is tied to mercury and some other environmental issues. When we can reduce the health impacts from pesticides that our children suffer from, when we can reduce the amount of children who suffer from lead in the drinking water and lead paint chips, that's what this fight is about. We have to find justice for our children, because they are 100% of the future. And I thank you.
Just want to echo the comments that have been said with a great deal of thanks. Shree, to you as our moderator, and to all my fellow panelists here, because I know of their passion and their commitment to environmental justice. Is not a slogan for any of them. It is a mission. It is a core belief. There's more work to be done, as was stated here this evening. And I actually have learned so much through this conversation. So I know there's more work to be done. But the commitment to getting that work and seeing it through, I think, is evident here tonight, that there's a lot of champions who are prepared to roll up their sleeves and do the work to move that forward. So I'm so eternally humbled and grateful to be in the company of those champions this evening. And I'm grateful for the good people from Now for allowing me to be a part of this evening's program. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to Now for inviting us here and for helping to spread the word. We've accomplished a lot in last year and a half. Everybody here, thanks to all my colleagues. Thanks Senator Singleton, and yeah, we still have some ways to go, but that's all right. We're getting there. You know, I think the fight for justice and environmental justice is almost like believing in the afterlife. You know, we will get there. The victory recently really helps us, buoys us up, but we know we have a long way to go. But you know, what do they say? It's not the journey, but the fight. No, it's not the destination, but it's the journey. Is that it? I'm getting it wrong. You know what I mean? And that's where we are as an EJ movement, right? We're going to stay on that journey and keep the fight going. And if we don't get there, someone else will.
And I must thank Senator Singleton once again. Today they passed the plastic bag legislation, and I do want to thank you. That's tremendous. So you are just like killing it, Senator Singleton. You are a true environmental champion, and we do thank you for your leadership and thank you for your support.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Second that.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here today and for your hard work in this movement. And I'm excited to see what it will bring in the years to come, considering, as Nicky was saying, we've been buoyed up by this recent victory. So thank you everyone for joining today. I also wanted to let you know that our programming continues next week with, on Tuesday, we're gonna be talking about menstrual equity with some really top national leaders in period poverty on Tuesday. So join us there. You can register on our website for the event, and it'll also be Facebook Live. And thank you again to all of our panelists. This was a really interesting conversation, and I learned a lot. And it's really exciting to always get to talk to the people who are really making it happen. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.